Burkina Faso just did something no one saw coming. And now the West can't breathe. For decades, Burkina Faso was little more than a footnote in the back pages of global news. Just another poor, landlocked nation, stripped of its gold, ignored by investors, and pitied by donors. The kind of place where stories start with a crisis and end with a blank stare. But then came 2022, and with it, Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't arrive in a limousine. He didn't come with Harvard degrees, World Bank lingo, or empty promises wrapped in foreign flags. He came in combat boots, with conviction, with a jaw clenched tight and a country behind him. And what he's doing now has the IMF reaching for its inhaler. Because in less than 2 years, this so-called forgotten state is building national airlines, processing its own gold, manufacturing EVs, launching food revolutions, and refusing foreign debt like it's poison. And here's the part no one expected. It's working. So no, this isn't Beijing. This isn't Silicon Valley. This is Burkina Faso. And it just might be the most rebellious country on earth right now. Meanwhile, the old powers watch, confused, offended, and terrified, because the question they hoped Africa would never ask is being asked aloud in Ouagadougou. What if we don't need you anymore? And before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, but not just your city. Tell us, what are you building? What do you believe your country should own, not borrow? Welcome to Africa Daily Good News, where we don't just read headlines, we rewrite the damn story. We're not here to show poverty, we're here to show power, especially the kind that scares old empires. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and welcome to the family. If you're returning and you already know what it is, let's build. Because what comes next isn't just about airports or factories, it's about sky, and who gets to touch it. Now let's take you there. A country without a coastline just flew a plane that rattled global airspace. For decades, if you asked someone in New York or Paris what they knew about Burkina Faso, you'd likely hear, "Is that a place?" Or worse, silence. On paper, it was a country with no sea, no wings, no leverage. Just dust, coups, and casualties. And yet, on October 2nd, 2024, a plane took off from Ouagadougou. But it wasn't just a plane. It was a declaration. A new Embraer E190, built in partnership with China, owned outright, not leased, not borrowed, not gifted. It lifted into the sky bound for the Central African Republic with a stop in Bamako. And in that brief moment, a nation the world once ignored flew above its former ceiling. That plane didn't just carry passengers, it carried proof. That sovereignty doesn't always begin with elections or constitutions. Sometimes, it begins with a flight path. Most Americans don't realize this, but for many African nations, commercial aviation is one of the final frontiers of control. For decades, skies were colonized in silence. European airlines owned the routes, decided the schedules, took the profits. Meanwhile, countries like Burkina Faso watched their own airports become symbols of immobility, terminals with no takeoffs. And that leaves a deeper impact than people think. According to behavioral research from Stanford, a person's sense of agency, the belief that they can move freely, is closely linked to their perception of national pride. When movement is outsourced, pride dims. And when pride dims, so does the belief in progress. That's why this isn't just about a plane. It's about the psychological weight of reclaiming movement. And here's the part they didn't expect. Traoré didn't launch Air Burkina for prestige. Oh shit. He did it for power, not the symbolic kind, but the kind that moves goods, connects capitals, drives trade. The new aircraft wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen for efficiency. Short runway capability, low fuel burn, strategic reach. The routes it now flies, Abidjan, Niamey, Bamako, aren't just destinations. They're trade arteries, now pulsing again with Burkinabe intention. But mobility without infrastructure is like freedom without legs. That's why, while some governments announce ambitions that stretch 20 years into the future, Traoré quietly started rebuilding from the ground, literally. In Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city, A full-scale airport overhaul is underway. 80 billion CFA francs, a new terminal designed to handle over 1.5 million passengers a year. Runways, taxiways, fuel storage, rebuilt, redefined. For a nation once grounded, it's not just expansion, it's repair. A man named Isaka works on the tarmac. He used to carry luggage at the old terminal, barely getting by. Today, he's training on aircraft logistics, part of the team preparing for international certifications. He said this, "I used to carry bags, now I carry systems." It's a simple sentence, but in it there's a before and an after. And maybe that's what progress really looks like. Not flashy slogans, but quiet shifts in who gets to matter. There's a phrase often thrown around in American airports. You are now free to move about the cabin. But what if that sentence applied to a country? Because what's unfolding in Burkina Faso right now feels exactly like that. And somewhere northeast of Ouagadougou, just 35 kilometers out, something even bigger is preparing for takeoff. In a country once synonymous with hunger, tractors now move like battalions, and no one's laughing. For years, Burkina Faso was boxed into one of the cruelest labels on earth: food insecure. That term sounds technical, sterile, until you realize it means farmers couldn't feed themselves, and children were more familiar with food aid logos than with seeds. Across much of the world, especially in the US, food is assumed. Even when the fridge is empty, the store is 5 minutes away. But what happens when the soil is yours and the hunger still stays? That was the quiet war Traoré decided to fight. Not on a battlefield, but on a field, with tractors, water pumps, and logistics trucks instead of rifles. And like most revolutions, it didn't start with a speech. It started with numbers. In 2024, over 78 billion CFA francs were poured into what his administration called an agro-pastoral offensive. The name alone sounded like something drafted by a general, not an agriculture minister. But maybe that's the point. When you've spent years depending on imports for dinner, reclaiming the plate becomes a national defense strategy. And it didn't stop at equipment. Alongside 400 tractors, 700 motor pumps, and an arsenal of farming gear, the government moved in with seed, fertilizer, fish feed, and animal feed by the tens of thousands of tons. It was supply chain warfare. Except this time, the supply stayed home. There's a small village outside of Barcelona where the change hit hard. A man named Alassane used to harvest 2 bags of millet per year, barely enough for his household. Now, with access to state-distributed inputs and a working pump, he's producing enough to sell. For the first time, he owns a mobile money account. For the first time, his kids eat before noon. To someone watching from Chicago or London, this may sound like a micro-win. But if you've ever watched a child skip breakfast, not by choice, but by condition, you know this isn't just agriculture. It's architecture of dignity. Most Americans would find it hard to imagine this kind of scarcity. According to USDA studies, over 30% of food in the US goes to waste every year. Not because it's inedible, but because it's convenient. Meanwhile, millions globally still live with harvests that fail not from lack of effort, but lack of infrastructure. That's the invisible injustice. And here's where the twist quietly unfolds. It's not just subsistence that's shifting. It's enterprise. In March 2025, the government launched a $200 million training initiative targeting 8,000 youth in agribusiness and technical farming. But here's the part the media often misses. These aren't just future farmers. They're engineers of a sovereign economy. Each graduate is promised land, tools, and access to capital, not just a job, but a share of the system. And the ecosystem is already forming. A cashew processing plant, 11 million investment, now employs thousands. A tomato factory, funded by locals and diaspora alike, processes 100 tons daily. But it's not the size that matters. It's what the factories represent. The end of the raw export era, the beginning of value staying where it was grown. There's a billboard outside Bobo Dioulasso that reads, "Grown here, made here, owned here." It's not a marketing slogan, it's a line in the sand. Because for a long time, the world taught African farmers they were too poor to process their own goods, too unskilled to scale, too risky to invest in. And now, those same farmers are standing beside machines they helped assemble, packaging cans they'll sell locally and abroad. There's a saying in rural America, don't bet against the land. But what happens when the land finally bets on itself? And just beyond those newly plowed rows, something else is starting to rise. Something heavy, metallic, and far more controversial than food. Burkina Faso just nationalized its gold, and somehow the world isn't screaming, but watching. In late 2024, the government quietly seized control of two major mines, Bangu and Wagnion. The price tag? Around 80 million. But the message wasn't in the money, it was in the audacity. A country that once watched its gold leave in dust and come back in luxury packaging now simply said, no more. It was an unexpected move, not just because of what it meant economically, but because of what it revealed politically. For decades, the gold industry here worked like a funnel. Wealth flowed in, resources flowed out, and local hands rarely touched the final product. In that system, ownership was invisible, and so was power. Then came the refinery. A new facility built in partnership with Marina Gold now processes up to 150 tons of gold annually. But again, it's not just about volume, it's about narrative. Because suddenly, the country that once shipped raw ore is now producing bullion on its own soil, adding value, creating jobs, setting prices. The shift is subtle but seismic. What most Americans may not realize is that this kind of vertical control, owning both the resource and the means to refine it, is something even advanced economies struggle with. In fact, according to the National Mining Association, the U.S. still depends on foreign refining for a majority of its rare earths. So imagine what it means for a landlocked African nation to flip that script, without the backing of Wall Street or the EU. And then, before the dust could even settle, they did it again. In March 2025, Captain Traoré inaugurated the Season SC cement plant. $43 million invested, 12.5 hectares wide, 2,000 tons produced daily. At first glance, it looks like just another factory. Concrete, dust, trucks, but behind the numbers is something harder to replicate. Autonomy. For years, cement was one of Burkina Faso's quiet dependencies, imported by the ton, priced by others, distributed on someone else's schedule. Which meant every road, school, or hospital built was delayed by decisions made outside its borders. That might sound minor, but anyone who's waited on a delayed permit or material shipment knows the feeling. It's not just frustration, it's powerlessness. Now, that's changing. Production is local, control is internal, and something surprising is happening. Timelines are shortening. Projects are finishing, crews are staying on site. The invisible hand holding things back isn't invisible anymore. It's just gone. And yet, the most human moment doesn't happen in the boardroom. It happens at the gate. A woman named Fadima comes every morning to the plant in Longo with her son. She's not an engineer, not a contractor. She sells lunch, rice and sauce mostly, but last month she applied for a microloan to build a covered food stand near the site. They told me my cement could come from here, she laughed. I told them it better. Her story isn't special, it's normal. And that's the twist. Progress in Burkina Faso is beginning to look ordinary, familiar, expected. And maybe that's the greatest threat to the old world order. Not a coup, not a protest, not a viral clip, but a functioning factory built without begging. Because once people realize they can build the things they were told they couldn't, it becomes very hard to convince them they shouldn't. Just past the edge of the cement plant, on roads now lined with Faso Danfani cloth and government-stitched uniforms, something newer is humming. Electric, silent, and unlike anything the country's ever built before. Burkina Faso just opened a state-owned bank, and for the first time, farmers are being treated like clients, not burdens. On October 7th, 2024, in a country where entire regions were once unbanked, President Traoré stood before the doors of the newly launched Post Bank of Burkina Faso, backed by 15 billion CFA francs, roughly 25 million. There were no private equity firms behind it, no flashy sponsorships, no slick Western fintech reps on stage, just a government, a treasury, and a promise that the money would finally circulate through the hands of those who'd never held it. The model was simple, but the shift it triggered was not. Most people in the West assume banking means apps, overdrafts, credit scores. But for millions across Africa, banking is still an inaccessible luxury, locked behind paperwork, geography, or intimidation. According to the World Bank, only 26% of adults in Burkina Faso had a bank account in 2021. Most of the rural population operated on cash, barter, or survival. Then suddenly the system cracked open. Through the new Post Bank, rural households can now open accounts, apply for agricultural loans, and access microcredit via mobile platforms. And it's not a promise on paper, it's an infrastructure rollout. The bank is decentralized, with branches appearing not just in urban centers, but in the overlooked corners. Kaya, Tenkodogo, Gawa. A tailor named Clarice Cease, 36, was one of the first microloan recipients in the southern district of Campti. She used the funds, barely $200, to buy a sewing machine and rent a stall. 6 months later, she hired her niece. "Before, I borrowed from neighbors," she said. "Now I have receipts." That sentence might seem small, but in it lives something Americans often take for granted: the psychological shift from survival to strategy, from asking to planning. Most U.S. adults, when surveyed, say they wouldn't switch banks unless forced. It's habitual, predictable, but in places where banking has never been personal, only extractive, offering access feels radical, even intimate. And here comes the deeper turn. The Post Bank isn't about credit lines. It's about dignity lines. Because when you make a farmer feel like a founder or a widow feel like a stakeholder, you don't just distribute money, you redistribute power. That's what caught global analysts off guard. This wasn't just a bank, it was a social infrastructure weapon. And paired with the healthcare reforms that followed, it became something bigger, a pattern. By late 2025, over 95,000 retirees and surviving spouses were registered to receive free annual checkups and medication vouchers through a new nationwide plan. Many of these individuals, once seen as financial dead ends, now appear in government databases as participants in a living economy, people who, with support, can still shape the community around them. In Bobo Dioulasso, construction began on the country's first geriatric hospital. It wasn't a flashy PR stunt. It was targeted, a response to decades of social architecture that treated the elderly as invisible. A man named Yakuba, age 71, who spent most of his life herding cattle, was among the first to receive his medical booklet. "I thought the only place I'd rest was the ground," he said. "Now I have a bed with my name on it." That line isn't policy, that's testimony. And it reveals a hard truth about development. Metrics don't matter if no one remembers your name. What Burkina Faso is doing here, quietly, without permission, is reshaping how people enter and exit the system. They're creating a compact that if you build the future won't forget you. And inside that compact, something is stirring. Because once the basics are dignified, the question becomes, what's possible beyond survival? Just south of the capital, panels are catching the sun and quietly powering a different kind of revolution. In a country where electricity was once a rumor, nuclear reactors are now part of national planning. Until recently, Burkina Faso's power grid looked more like a patchwork than a system. As late as 2023, only around 21% of the population had reliable access to electricity, most of it clustered in urban centers. Entire villages, sometimes entire provinces, remained dark. Not metaphorically, literally. No light after sunset, no cold storage, no internet, no chance to scale anything. And yet, by mid-2025, Burkina Faso had signed a formal cooperation agreement with Russia's state-owned Rosatom, aiming to develop civilian nuclear power from scratch. The kind of leap most developing nations spend decades preparing for. Here, it was treated not as a gamble, but a necessity. The reaction abroad was exactly what you'd expect. Raised eyebrows, cautious headlines, hushed concern behind diplomatic curtains. A nuclear plan? From a country that, until recently, couldn't keep the lights on? But that's the twist. Because maybe the places that lived without energy the longest understand best what it's really worth. The agreement includes not just infrastructure, but also training, safety protocols, regulatory systems, an entire nuclear roadmap. And while global media barely blinked, the move sent quiet ripples through West Africa. For many, it wasn't about uranium or energy. It was about sovereignty. Most Americans have never questioned the idea of flipping on a light. But according to research from the Energy Information Administration, nearly 770 million people worldwide still live without reliable electricity. In those regions, off-grid isn't a lifestyle choice, it's a life sentence. And in that context, nuclear energy is less about futurism and more about freedom. That said, Burkina Faso isn't putting all its watts in one basket. In recent years, the country has also accelerated its solar infrastructure strategy. The Zagtuli plant near Ouagadougou, launched in 2017, produces 33 megawatts annually. In May 2024, the Zena solar farm added another 26.6 megawatts. Combined, these projects now deliver cleaner, local power to thousands of homes, clinics, and schools. And underneath all of it, something quieter is happening. The idea of energy is shifting, from privilege to baseline. There's a small primary school outside of Dédougou. Until 2022, their only light source came from kerosene lamps, dim, smoky, and dangerous. In early 2025, the school was connected to the expanded solar grid. On the first night the lights came on, the teacher stayed after hours. She wanted to prepare for the next day, for the first time, without rushing against darkness. A parent who dropped by later told her, "Now our kids will see their future before it arrives." It's a line that doesn't show up in press releases, but it tells you everything. Because electricity isn't just about machines, it's about momentum. When people can store food, charge phones, refrigerate medicine, or just read after 7 p.m., behavior shifts. Aspirations scale. Families plan. Whole villages adjust their sleep schedules. That's not development, that's redesign. And just like that, the dominoes start falling. In parallel with solar and nuclear investment, Burkina Faso secured control of an oil terminal in Ghana and expanded its domestic fuel reserves by over 100,000 cubic meters. Critics called it risky. Supporters called it insurance. Either way, the subtext was clear. No more depending on unstable pipelines or third-party margins. Control the fuel, control the fallback. Most people don't think about what powers their homes until it stops working. But if you've ever lost power for days, during a storm, during a wildfire, during a grid failure, you know it's not just inconvenient. It's destabilizing. It cuts through confidence. It reminds you how fragile comfort is. And in a country where fragility used to be the norm, stability is starting to look expected. From rooftop panels to underground storage tanks, from Russian contracts to village switchboards, the grid is no longer a metaphor. It's literal, and slowly, it's glowing. The next time someone questions whether a country like Burkina Faso is ready for advanced technology, it might be worth asking, ready by whose standard? Because in a world designed to gatekeep progress, maybe the real revolution is realizing you never needed permission. Somewhere outside the capital, a hum is growing. Not from wires, but from engines. And they're not running on fuel alone. In a country once flooded with secondhand clothes and used cars, engineers are now assembling electric vehicles, with zero blueprint from Detroit. Burkina Faso's first domestically designed electric vehicle rolled out quietly in early 2025. No flashy unveiling, no drone shots, just a workshop in Ouaga 2000, a crew of local engineers, and a battery-powered chassis that somehow changed everything. The vehicle, nicknamed Itaway, isn't sleek or futuristic. It won't win design awards, but it travels 320 kilometers on a single charge. Fully recharges in 30 minutes, comes GPS-enabled, solar-ready, and was built by people who, A decade ago, we're importing used motorcycles from Europe just to get to work. To someone watching from Los Angeles or Frankfurt, this might feel symbolic at best. But to a country used to being the last stop in the supply chain, building something that moves, physically, commercially, and politically, isn't a stunt. It's strategy. And here's the part most reports gloss over. Burkina Faso's EV is not being built for global markets. It's being built for its own terrain, its own economy. The goal isn't to compete with Tesla, it's to not rely on Toyota. That kind of thinking unnerves traditional power brokers. Because when a country stops chasing modernity, defined by others, and starts building function-first systems on its own terms, it stops playing catch-up and starts playing something else entirely. And it doesn't stop at cars. In the textile sector, second-hand imports, once the norm, are now being phased out. In their place, locally made Faso Danfani fabric, stitched into police uniforms, courtroom robes, school attire. Some of it made by national cooperatives. Some by former tailors now contracted by the state. The logic is elegant. When the state becomes your biggest client, survival turns into scale. In Bobo Dioulasso, a group of women's cooperatives recently fulfilled a 5,000-piece uniform order for the Education Ministry. A member named Aminata told local press, "We used to work to eat, now we work to plan." That may sound like a small jump, but for many women globally, that's the entire arc of economic freedom. And then there's the cement, the one thing every country needs but few ever fully control. The new calcined clay unit outside Kudugu, paired with solar-powered kilns, cuts carbon emissions significantly. It's not just eco-conscious, it's self-aware. Because Burkina Faso isn't trying to go green for applause. It's doing it because fossil fuel dependency was never just about energy. It was about leverage. There's something deeply human about building with your own materials, about paving roads not just literally, but philosophically. Because when people walk across surfaces they helped make, they carry themselves differently. That's what's happening now, quietly but undeniably. Whether it's cashew shells, cotton threads, car batteries, or cement dust, Burkinabe labor is beginning to echo. And here comes the deeper, more uncomfortable shift, especially for outside observers. This transformation isn't loud. It doesn't beg for headlines. It doesn't flatter NGOs. It moves the way roots do. Unseen, unglamorous, but irreversible. In American discourse, there's often a romantic idea that revolutions look like protests or charismatic speeches. But real change? It often sounds like machines turning on at 6 a.m., a mother signing her first invoice, a student using power tools without asking permission. These aren't photo ops, they're foundation. The boy who once walked miles to borrow a neighbor's light now calibrates solar sensors in his backyard. The man who dug ditches for other people's pipelines now delivers fuel from his own depot. The tailors, drivers, farmers, welders, they're not just working, they're composing something. Not a miracle, a system. And maybe, if you've ever felt underestimated, by the place you're from, by the job you work, by the map you occupy, maybe you recognize this moment more than you expected. Because what's happening in Burkina Faso right now isn't designed for your admiration, it's built to outlive it. Burkina Faso didn't wait for permission to rise. It simply started building while no one was watching. And maybe that's what stings the most. Not the ambition, but the fact that it wasn't announced in glossy panels or global forums. There were no white papers, no consultants flown in, just people, picking up the tools they were once told they couldn't handle. From gold mines to garment factories, from microloans to megawatts, what we've witnessed isn't a development plan, it's a redefinition of possible. Quiet, deliberate, and increasingly hard to dismiss. Because for a long time, Africa's role was tightly scripted. Resource provider, aid recipient, cautionary tale. But Burkina Faso is tearing pages out of that script and replacing them with schematics, contracts, infrastructure. And here's the twist. Many of the things it's now building are things even the West is struggling to get right. Clean energy, local manufacturing, food sovereignty, public banking. According to a 2024 Gallup survey, nearly 68% of Americans say they feel their country is no longer investing in things that matter. Roads crumble, prices rise, Community feels transactional. Progress feels privatized. But what if the answers aren't locked in size or GDP, but in the discipline to design systems that serve, not impress? Because Khan and Gui, if given the space, will always build toward dignity. We want to be part of something real, tangible, shared. And what's unfolding in Burkina Faso right now isn't just infrastructure, it's identity construction. It's not charity, it's not defiance, it's a country deciding that survival is no longer enough. You can feel it in the rhythm of freight moving on new roads, in the hum of solar panels, in the confidence of students whose uniforms now come from local hands, in the eyes of retirees who no longer fade quietly. Every one of those moments adds up, not to spectacle, but to structure. And structure lasts longer than speeches. So if you've been watching this series from afar, maybe now's the time to ask, not just what this means for Burkina Faso, but what it says about the systems we assume are fixed, the roles we assume are permanent. Are they, and more importantly, should they be? Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? What part of your life, your town, your economy, your habits, feels overdue for a rewrite? Because maybe what Burkina Faso is showing us is that rewriting doesn't start with revolution. It starts with refusal, to be small, to be silent, to be outsourced. And once that refusal is made, loud or quiet, it becomes very, very hard to go back.